Now, the few of the challenges that sort of we've tackled, and these are UN challenges, it's really trying to achieve what we call here policy coherence. And what is it? Well, particularly after the Kobe conference, many organizations, governments, you're all part of the Yoga Framework for Action, of course, have introduced policies or policy statements on risk reduction. But, well, some of them are very weak and therefore provide no guidance, but they have no internal coherence. One, they have no internal coherence mostly with governments, organizations, other policies, nor do they have it between them. So how do we actually achieve sufficient traction? So that's one of the issues that we are initiating discussions with governments now. We start with donor governments because other governments, this will happen in regional platforms and other forums. We have the issue of resources. I know you've discussed resources a lot, but tapping into partnership resources. I am personally trying to get even ISDR to establish a modus operandi where our first thought is also who can do this and pay for it, rather than how do we get others to do it if we pay for it. So that you mobilize not only other people's energy, insight, but also their resources to achieve things. So it's not always this sense of that resources should be the limitation for moving the agenda ahead. But at the same time, because of the lack of policy coherence, it's not very straightforward to get disaster risk reduction money out of donors. Just like we are now in a discussion how to tap into the climate adaptation money. We can talk a bit about how we are doing it and how many are doing it. It's unfortunately maybe an issue of terminology more than substance, which is a good opportunity. Then we have in our collaborative, and this is of course not only a discussion we've had for years, is the different working sort of cooperation models of NGOs at international level, at civil society, and the UN system. And sometimes, although many of you, I'm sure, have had more or less effective and positive, but you have had partnerships with the UN entities and other intergovernmental organizations. But others feel that this institutionally we are almost impenetrable. And you will say the UN is very competitive, and we will say, well, who are the NGOs after all? I think there's a change in this. I can see that some of the international NGOs are really looking at their structures and their models of working. At national level, then we have the other, how should I use a constructive word? Well, occasional attention between the international NGOs and the national NGOs in terms of how you work, resources, inclusion, etc. And then you have at national level the triangle government, civil society, and then the internationals. And there, I think the internationals, we are very often in the same bunch, the NGOs and the UN, vis-a-vis the local. So, I think I feel so much positive momentum, so I think we are actually coming much closer to begin to not resolve the problem, but actually find models of collaboration where we can begin to bridge all these classical ways of watching each other. But some of the challenges really, I think, for NGOs remains very clearly. Your diversity, which ICRC has taught us to say that diversity is a positive thing. But it is, diversity means that you really have some challenges in, you have only one brand name, which is NGO, but it doesn't say anything about you individually, what you represent, because you're such an enormously diverse entity. And does it matter? I don't know. It's a bit up to you to decide whether it matters or not. But I can tell you from our perspective, from the perspective that I work with, what you have done with the views from the front line is that you have got yourself a very strong branding within the risk reduction community. Thanks to that report, there is now a face, a recognition, and an understanding of what you represent. not because you're NGO or civil society, but through what you have done, the work that you've done, and you put that forward. And that's sort of my feeling, is that you've done something which is quite remarkable through that work. So these different challenges of, and you have all highlighted them, is, you know, what do we do with classical tensions and confrontations? Well, sometimes it's perceptions. It's not necessarily the reality, but since we can work in parallel tracks, particularly with governments, both humanitarian UN agencies, they've had the slight tendency to rather distance themselves from government instead of do all they can to get inside the government. I think that's the opportunity we have now to change that. And then I think we should, when we discuss this thing, let's define what government is. You can have an extraordinary good relationship with the local government, but none at all with the central government. So just like we're trying to be more precise about ourselves, let's try to think about that with governments as well. I know you've discussed a lot this how do we put a face to community? Community is a label we use a lot. We refer to them. We sometimes think we represent communities. But how do we actually have working processes that turn communities' political capability into policy input and processes? And how do we ensure that communities don't have masses of intermediaries who make themselves the representatives of communities? But, you know, do you have any thoughts of how communities become more real, so that it's not just a point of reference for us? And then we have this the vertical cooperation from local level to national level. What are the leverage points so that we can, also for the UN, but for you, because I think what UN would come in at national level, sometimes at regional level, depends on how big the country is. But the UN is not a community organization, obviously. We have, that's not the way we should operate. We are there to work with governments, with organizations. But our working style and our methodology and our knowledge is not at the community level. So those articulation points between the community, local level, national, international, regional, are becoming more visible, and the way ISDR and others are working, I think we will make them increasingly visible over the years to come. So, as Marcus has already said, we're very determined. The civil society is a key stakeholder in our international risk reduction process. We have to now use the work that you have already done and make sure that that's an effective part and an influential part of the continued work. For example, I just say that I have already discussed this quite a lot with Marcus, that in our preparatory work for the Global Platform 2011, we have already started conversations with all the stakeholder groups, so to say. And for the practical purposes, I consider you to be the stakeholder representatives of civil society for now, unless you, in how we can have a working process from now up to the platform that makes sure that the priorities of, for example, communities emerge, that we turn this into consultative processes and then into substantive engagement and dialogue at the platforms, sometimes at regional platforms as well. And then when we get to the global platform, we have a much stronger grip on the outcome of the platform through a consistent process over the next almost 18 months. And there, you know, we need you to tell us through what process that can be made practical for civil society elements. That's just an example. But I do think with that particular engagement and how you engage in the global platform, what we can contribute is to provide that space for engagement of civil society in what is essentially political processes. You know, in fact, I think that you are part of the political space. Of course you are part of the political space. You may not want to call yourself political, but in a society where there are different elements that come together, everything that we do to collaborate is political action. When we try to influence governments, policy making, how they allocate resources, that's politics in its most basic. sort of use that sense of that you're part of something big.